Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to, cut through the noise and get you the insights you actually need. Today, we're tackling a big one, a question I bet keeps a lot of you IT folks up at night. How do you actually move your virtual machines, your VMs, from something like VMware over to an open source platform like Proxmox? And crucially, how do you do it without basically shutting everything down?
Yeah, that's the dream, isn't it? The holy grail of IT ops, live migration with almost no hiccup. It feels almost impossible sometimes, especially when you think about what's running on those VMs.
Exactly. Every second counts for those critical workloads.
Yeah.
Downtime costs real money, real reputation points.
Right, and that's why Proxmox VE is getting so much attention. It's a really strong alternative. You get flexibility, it's cost-effective, it's open source, so you escape that, pricey vendor lock-in.
But that migration step,
Yeah.
moving a live VM, it still feels a bit like trying to defuse a bomb, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You need a steady hand.
Absolutely. It needs smart planning, careful execution. But the good news is the IT community, they've been busy. People have been experimenting, sharing what works. There's some really solid, battle-tested ways to make this jump much smoother than you'd think.
And that's exactly what we're going to dig into today. This deep dive is all about unpacking those community strategies that aim for near-zero downtime. We want to show you how to move your essential stuff without all the drama. So let's start right there. Why is live migration, moving that running VM, so important? What makes even a short outage such a big deal for businesses?
Well, fundamentally, it's about business continuity. Like you said, for important stuff, every second matters. Think about e-commerce platforms or critical databases, services that just have to be up constantly. Any downtime, even if it's brief, can mean lost sales, unhappy customers, maybe even data integrity issues depending on the application.
Right, so the goal is
Right.
get most of the data moved beforehand.
Exactly. The ideal scenario, the gold standard really, is you pre-seed almost all the data onto the new Proxmox system while the VM is still running on VMware. Then right at the end, you just sync the very last changes, the delta, right before you flip the switch.
So the actual moment of downtime is tiny.
Almost negligible, yeah. That's the aim.
Okay, so in looking into this, the name migrate came up a lot, specifically for OpenStacks. People seem to see that as like the benchmark. What makes it so good, and how does Proxmox's own tools stack up against that ideal?
Yeah.
You mentioned resource issues.
Right. migrate is often held up as a great example because it's, purpose-built for live migrations in that specific OpenStack environment. It's deeply integrated. Now, Proxmox does have its own built-in feature, the live import tool, and on paper, it sounds pretty neat. It streams the disk over the network in real time.
Sounds efficient.
It can be, but, and this is a big but for busy VMs, it can absolutely hammer your storage I/O, your input output. It's constantly reading from the source and writing to the destination while the VM is live. For a server that's already working hard, that can become a major performance bottleneck.
The I/O hammer effect.
Yeah.
Okay, so that pushes people towards other methods.
Often, yes. Especially for critical or high-traffic VMs, it leads them to look for strategies that are maybe less I/O intensive during that critical running phase, which brings us back to those community strategies.
Okay, so if the built-in tool has these potential I/O issues, what's strategy number one from the community playbook? What's the popular alternative?
Probably the most popular and honestly quite elegant method is what people often call the NFS trick.
The NFS trick. Sounds intriguing.
It is. And it's surprisingly straightforward. The whole idea is you use a shared storage space, specifically an NFS share, that both your VMware setup and your Proxmox setup can see and access at the same time.
Like a neutral territory for the data.
Exactly. It avoids having to copy the entire massive disk image directly between the hypervisors during that final cutover moment. That's what drastically cuts down the actual downtime.
Okay, I'm following. So walk us through it. How does this NFS trick work in practice, step by step?
Okay, so first things first. You need to make sure both your VMware hosts and your Proxmox server can mount and access the exact same NFS share. This is your staging area.
Got it. Shared access.
Second, you use a standard VMware feature called Storage vMotion. You use this to move the VM's main disk file, the VMDK, onto that NFS share you just set up.
The VM stays online during this storage vMotion.
Correct. That's the beauty of Storage vMotion. The VM keeps running, serving users, while its data is shifted onto the NFS share in the background.
Clever. Okay, step 3.
Step 3, you hop over to your Proxmox interface. You create a new VM, but it's essentially just a shell, a dummy VM for now. The key is you configure this dummy VM to use storage from that same NFS share where the VMDK now lives.
So it's like a placeholder pointing to the live data on the NFS share.
Yeah.
But wait, what about compatibility? VMware uses VMDK. Proxmox uses KVM drivers.
Excellent question. That brings us to a really critical preparation step. Before you make the final switch, while the VM is still running on VMware, or maybe during a brief maintenance window just before the cut, you need to do two things inside the VM's operating system. First, uninstall VMware tools. Second, install the Virtio drivers. These are the open source para-virtualized drivers that Proxmox uses for best performance with network and disk devices.
Okay, so prep the guest OS, remove VMware tools, install Virtio drivers. That has to happen before the shutdown on VMware.
Precisely. Get those drivers in place first. Then, when you're ready for the actual cutover, you schedule your brief downtime, you shut down the VM cleanly on the VMware side, then immediately you go to that dummy VM you created on Proxmox, reconfigure it slightly to point directly to the existing VMDK file in the NFS share, and you boot it up.
And the downtime is just the shutdown time on VMware plus the boot up time on Proxmox.
Pretty much. Usually we're talking seconds, maybe a minute or two, depending on the OS boot time. For most critical services, that's incredibly manageable compared to copying terabytes of data.
Wow. Okay, I can see why that's popular. That's near zero downtime territory.
Yeah.
So once it's running on Proxmox but still technically living on the NFS share, are you stuck there? Or can you move it to faster local storage or Ceph or something?
No, you're definitely not stuck. That's another advantage. Once the VM is up and stable on Proxmox running from NFS, you can then use Proxmox's own built-in migration tools, usually via the web interface, to move the VM's disk from the NFS share to your preferred final storage, whether that's local ZFS, Ceph cluster, whatever you use. Proxmox handles that migration in the background, often including the disk format conversion from VMDK to COW2 or RAW.
And Proxmox handles the conversion too. Nice. What about safety nets? What if something goes wrong right after the switch?
That's another good point about the NFS method. Because the original VMDK is sitting on that NFS share, you can often leverage NFS snapshot capabilities. If the VM doesn't boot correctly on Proxmox or there's some other issue, you potentially have a very quick rollback path by reverting the VM on the VMware side or using an NFS snapshot.
Ah, a quick fallback. That's reassuring. Now, you mentioned Ceph as a possible destination. I feel like there was a specific detail to remember there.
Yes, good catch. One important caveat for planning. If your final destination storage within Proxmox is a Ceph cluster, you need to remember that Ceph primarily works with the raw disk image format. So while Proxmox can move the VMDK from NFS, it will likely need to perform an additional conversion step to raw format specifically for Ceph, either during or after the migration from NFS. It's just something to factor into your timing and process if Ceph is the end goal.
Okay, makes sense. Plan for that raw conversion if using Ceph. So the NFS trick, powerful minimal downtime, seems like the community favorite. Let's circle back to Proxmox's own live import tool. You mentioned it streams data but had caveats. Can you remind us how that works and what those risks are again?
Sure. The Proxmox live import mechanism is conceptually different. It actually boots the VM on Proxmox while the primary disk data still resides on the VMware data store. Proxmox accesses the original VMDK over the network, reading blocks of data as the VM needs them, while simultaneously copying and converting those blocks to its own storage in the background.
So it comes online faster initially, but the copy happens while it's running.
Exactly. It tries to bring the VM online quickly on Proxmox while the bulk data transfer happens behind the scenes.
What about downtime with this one? You mentioned it still needs some? And those risks?
It does still require a short downtime, yeah. Right at the very end, when all the initial data is copied, it needs to pause the VM briefly to sync the very last writes that happened during the copy process and then complete the cutover. But the bigger concerns are performance and risk. As we mentioned, it can be much slower overall for large or busy VMs because it's constantly hitting the network and both storage systems. That I/O pressure can be significant.
And the risk factor.
The risk is data loss, potentially. If something goes wrong during that background copy, maybe a network interruption, maybe a storage issue on the Proxmox side, any writes that the VM made during the import process, which were temporarily stored on Proxmox but hadn't been fully committed or synced from the original, could be lost.
Oof. So the original VM on VMware would still exist, but it wouldn't have the absolute latest changes made just before the failure.
Precisely. You'd have the VMware original, but it would be missing potentially critical recent data. It's like hitting rewind, but maybe further back than you wanted. That's a significant risk for many production workloads.
Yeah, that sounds riskier than the NFS method's potential issues.
It generally is, which is why recommendation is always test this thoroughly with a non-critical VM first, And absolutely ensure you have a very stable, high bandwidth network between your VMware and Proxmox environments before even attempting it with anything important.
Okay, so NFS Trick seems like the safer bet for near zero downtime. What about looking outside these two methods? Did the community find any third-party tools that can bridge this gap effectively for live migration?
People have definitely looked hard. Everyone loves a good off-the-shelf tool, but unfortunately, the options specifically for live VMware to Proxmox migration are still pretty limited. Popular tools like Veeam or Starwind's V2V converter, while great for other types of migrations or backups, they just don't currently support live running replication directly to Proxmox as a target.
What about simpler tools like ShareSync? Can that work?
Well, rsync is fantastic for copying files, obviously. You could use it for an offline migration, sure, but the key problem is it can't handle the disk format conversion while the VM is running, so it doesn't really solve the live migration challenge itself.
I remember reading about some really elaborate setups. There was one using a load balancer. Did that gain any traction?
Yeah, that was a really creative approach. Someone figured out you could potentially use a load balancer to sort of smoothly shift traffic from the live VM on VMware to a pre-staged running copy on Proxmox. It involved having both VMs running simultaneously for a bit. While technically clever, it's generally seen as, well, overkill for most situations. It has a whole other layer of complexity managing the load balancer, ensuring data sync that probably isn't necessary for typical VM moves.
Any other tools mentioned? Coriolis.
Coriolis came up in discussions. It's more of a general cloud migration platform. Its specific compatibility and effectiveness for direct, live VMware to Proxmox isn't really well established or commonly reported in the community forums, as far as I've seen. It's not the go-to solution people are talking about.
So it really feels like there's a gap in the market here.
Yeah.
There isn't that one perfect, purpose-built tool everyone's using.
That's the reality right now, yeah. What's genuinely missing is something akin to that migrate kit we mentioned earlier, but specifically designed for seamless live VMware to Proxmox transitions. Until something like that appears, the community has had to get resourceful, stitching together these best practices like the NFS trick, using built-in features carefully and sharing what works through forums and direct experience. It's more about technique than a single tool.
Okay, that makes sense. It's about the method, not just the software.
Yeah.
So we've covered the how. Let's talk about the why, beyond just migration. Why Proxmox in the first place? What makes it, as people say, such a sweet deal that justifies making this jump?
Oh, there are plenty of reasons people are drawn to Proxmox. A big one is simply escaping the VMware licensing costs and complexity. Proxmox offers really powerful, full-featured virtualization without those hefty price tags and sometimes complicated licensing audits. It's built on Debian Linux, which is rock-solid, familiar to many admins, and gives you a stable foundation. Plus, it supports both full virtual machines using KVM and lightweight Linux containers using LXC, all managed through one interface. That flexibility is huge.
KVM and LXC on one platform, built on Debian. Yeah, I can see the appeal.
And the platform itself is constantly improving. The developers are actively adding features, especially around storage migration and supporting common formats like VMDK directly, which, as we've seen, really helps with these kinds of transitions.
It sounds like a robust, evolving platform. Any other sort of side tips or optimizations people should think about, either during the move or once they're running on Proxmox?
Yeah, a couple of things come to mind. If you are using the NFS trick, definitely try to use NFS version 4.1 or later if possible. It generally offers better performance and locking mechanisms compared to older versions. For ongoing operations, backups are critical, obviously. Tools specifically designed for Proxmox, like Vincian Backup and Recovery, seem to be gaining a lot of traction and positive reviews in the community. Worth looking into.
Backups, always key. Anything else?
And for the more adventurous, don't forget, Proxmox has a pretty comprehensive API. If you're comfortable with scripting, you can automate a lot of tasks. Or even just using command line tools like Kimu MA directly for disk conversions or inspections can be really powerful. Proxmox doesn't hide the underlying tools from you.
Right, it gives you that control. Okay, this has been super insightful. To really boil it down for our listeners, if you had to give a concise checklist, like the pro tips learned the hard way for making this move smoother, what would be on it?
Okay, the essential checklist based on community wisdom. 1. Start with the test VM. Always. Something non-critical. Work out the kinks there first.
Absolutely. Test, test, test.
2. Uninstall VMware tools. Install Virtio drivers before you attempt the final migration. Non-negotiable for guest OS compatibility.
Got it. Drivers first.
3. Seriously, assess your storage, especially if using NFS or the live import tool. Can it really handle the load? Don't underestimate the I/O demands.
Right, check the plumbing.
4. Even with live methods, schedule the actual cutover for off-peak hours. Always gives you more breathing room if something unexpected happens.
Common sense, but easily forgotten.
5. Backups. Cannot stress this enough. Use Vincian. Use Proxmox backup server. Use something. Have a verified backup before you start.
Your ultimate undo button.
6. Monitor things during the migration. Keep an eye on network bandwidth, storage I/O, CPU usage on both source and destination. Know what's happening.
Data's good.
And 7, double-check those disk format conversions, especially, as we said, if Ceph is your target. Remember that raw format requirement.
Perfect. That's a really solid, actionable list. So, wrapping this all up, it really sounds like moving to Proxmox isn't just about changing hypervisors. It's a genuine opportunity,
Yeah.
right? A chance to cut those recurring costs, simplify licensing, and really take back control over your own infrastructure.
Absolutely. And I think the key takeaway is that achieving this with minimal downtime, minimal drama, it's not some impossible dream. The community has shown it's very possible using these strategies we've discussed.
You don't necessarily need some magic, expensive toolkit.
Nope. What you need is good planning, careful testing, and maybe a little bit of that willingness to experiment and follow the steps that others have already proven work. The groundwork has definitely been laid by the community.
So the message is, if you're feeling the pinch from VMware's pricing, or you just want the flexibility and control of open source, Proxmox is a serious contender, and the migration path is clearer than ever.
The community's figured out the tricky parts. They've shared the maps.
So the final thought for you, our listener, is you're ready to make that jump. The strategies are there. The community support is there. Now it's your turn. What critical workload are you going to migrate first?